In Chapter 12, our focus is going to be creating samples and surveying and proper techniques involved with all of that. This first lesson, we're going to focus on what types of samples can we choose from a population so that we have a good sample and get good results. So let's talk about some vocab. What is a population? A population is the entire group that we want to know about. It may not be the entire population of the world, but maybe our focus is we want to know something about Hazelwood West High School students. So our entire population is all Hazelwood West High School students. So then what is a sample? A sample is a smaller group of individuals that are selected from that population. And it's supposed to be a group that represents the entire population. Our next vocab word, what is a sample survey? This is when we ask questions of that smaller sample group, hoping to learn something about the entire population. And so that's why it is so very important that when we select a sample of people, that we select a sample that is a representation of the entire population. So sampling methods that tend to overemphasize or underemphasize some characteristics of the population are said to be biased. Okay, bias is a word that we are going to be talking about quite a bit in the second lesson. How do we choose a sample that properly represents the population without having that bias? Okay, if we want a population that represents all of Hazelwood West High School, you do not want all freshmen who are all white. You want some of all of the grades. You want some of all of the backgrounds and all of the cultures and all of the races. That way it covers all of the school. So let's look at some of the various sampling methods that we have available to us. The first and most basic sampling method is what's called a simple random sample. So in this type of sampling, every single individual must have an equal chance of being selected. To select our sample, we must have a sampling frame. A sampling frame, this word right here, this is just another word for the population. It's the list of individuals that we are drawing from. So when we are drawing a sample, we are always drawing from the population. So the sampling frame is the population. And this list, we need to be able to list all of the students to draw from. Then we need to assign a random number to each individual. That way we know that number 1 is this person and number 2 is this person. And then we use either our random number generator or the table. So those options that we learned in chapter 11, we use those to randomly generate and select individuals. Now, many times when we do surveys, we select multiple samples. And because each of these samples are drawn at random, and each of those samples will contain different people, we might get different results. Okay, the sample to sample differences we call sampling variability. Each sample will be slightly different because it will have different people in them. So you may get different results, and those results and those differences are called sampling variability. Now, a simple random sample, which by the way, you will see it abbreviated SRS a lot. A simple random sample is by far the simplest sample, and it's the standard that we use and measure all other sampling techniques against. So this is the very basic. Now let's look at some other options that maybe are applicable to different situations. The next type of sample is called a stratified random sample. This kind of random sample, the first thing we do is we take the population and we slice it or divide it into homogeneous groups. A homogeneous group is a group that has something in common. So let's say, for instance, at Hazelwood West High School, we might separate everyone into their grade level. So each group, their one thing that they have in common is they all are in the same grade level. Or maybe we separate them by gender. Everybody in the same gender in the same group has the same gender. Or perhaps we separate them by your ethnicity. So everybody in the group has the same ethnicity. These groups are called strata. That's the fancy term. You can call them groups, but strata is the fancy word. So again, these groups could be based on income, gender, age, race, where you live, anything that would give you something to be alike with other people. Once you've separated these people into groups, then we go back to using a simple random sample to select individuals in each strata. Okay? So then we take all of these people that we selected from the groups and we put them together. So how this is helpful is because we are grouping people into strata, things that they have in common, additional samples are more like one another. So your samples should be more similar so that your statistics then that you calculate from the samples, and when you give your surveys and you gather data, there should be less variability within those results because your samples should be more similar than in a simple random sample. So a lot of times stratified sampling can reduce bias and help us to notice differences among groups more easily because we're separating people into groups. So this is another type of sampling. Let's look at a third type. Cluster sampling. Now this is different than stratified. This time we are taking the population and we are dividing it into heterogeneous groups. That means that the groups do not have something in common. They're all very different. And we hope that each one of these groups is kind of like a small population. So these little heterogeneous groups you create should be broken apart similar to what the population looks like. So you want to make sure that if we're using Hazelwood West again, you would want to make sure that each of the groups has some of every grade level, some of every gender, some of every ethnicity, some of every ability in terms of education. Then what we do is instead of selecting from every group, we select one group or maybe two groups, and we call these clusters, and we perform a census, which is a survey of the entire group for those clusters. So maybe we take the school and we divide it into 8 clusters. So then we just select one of those clusters randomly and we sample everybody in that cluster. And if each cluster fairly represents the full population, then cluster sampling should give us an unbiased sample. And because each cluster should have a similar makeup, because they are supposed to be like the population, okay, they should have a similar makeup of the population. And our results should be able to be compared pretty easily. So let's continue. We have one more type of good sampling. Our last type of good sampling is what's called systematic sampling. We do this by drawing or selecting individuals systematically. So for example, you might have an alphabetical list and you might select every 10th person on that alphabetical list. To make it random though, you need to make sure that you start the systematic selection from a randomly selected individual. So you have a list of everybody in the school. Everybody is assigned a number. Okay, obviously we can use their ID numbers because those are distinctive. And we can then use a calculator to randomly select one ID number. And we go to that person. And then from that person, we select every 10th person or every 20th person. Just depends upon how big you want your sample. When there is no reason to believe that the order of the list could be associated in any way with the responses sought, systematic sampling can give a representative sample of the population. The best way to organize your list is alphabetically. Then you know you are not affecting the sample because you specifically ordered them in a certain way. So alphabetical is always the easiest way to organize, and then you can start anywhere and count systematically. And you should get a pretty good sample of the population. Now, there's one more type of sampling, but this is bad sampling. So far, the ones we've covered, simple random sampling, stratified, cluster, and systematic, these are all good methods. None of these should produce bias. We've one, however, that is bad. It's called convenience sampling. What this is choosing people that are convenient. So you are wanting to survey people, so you go to a mall and you stand there and you question every 10th person to walk into the mall. That's not always good, because if you're questioning them about something related to the mall, anybody who doesn't like the mall, you're not getting their opinions. Or maybe you are surveying the first 500 people that arrive at a baseball game. Yes, it's convenient, but the people who didn't go to the baseball game don't get surveyed, or the people who maybe had to work late and are running late, they don't get sampled. Even though it might be worded to sound random, like for instance, every 10th person walking into the mall, this will definitely not give a true representation of the population. Okay, what about the people who didn't like shopping? What about the people who don't like baseball? This is an easy method for sampling, but it will always show bias in the results. So convenience sampling is bad sampling. So let's just see if we can figure out what type of sampling we have. So for their class project, a group of statistics students decide to survey the student body to assess opinions about the proposed new student center. Their sample of 200 contained 50 first-year students, 50 sophomores, 50 juniors, and 50 seniors. Was this group formed using a very simple random sample, the kind where you just draw names out of a hat or you use a table to calculate people? So was this the case? Was this a simple random sample? The thing that should give kind of a big, quick, no, this is not, are these numbers right here. The 50s. That's a very specific amount that stays consistent the entire time. That should be a clue that this is not a simple random sample. Okay, because we ended up with the exact same amount of students from each grade level. This is not a simple random sample. So then what is this? Well, when you end up with the exact same number of people out of each group, that was when we separated them into groups and specifically chose the same amount from each group. That was what was called stratified. Okay, this was using a stratified random sample. They separated the school into grade levels and then chose 50 students from each group. Okay, so if you have that same amount, that's a big clue that it's stratified. Look at another one. Major League Baseball tests players to see whether they are using performance-enhancing drugs. Officials select a team at random, and drug test crews show up unannounced to test all 40 players on the team. Each testing day can be considered a study of drug use in Major League Baseball. So what kind of sample is this? They show up at one team and they drug test the entire team. Anytime you do an entire group of one team, that's cluster. This is cluster sampling. Each baseball team represents a cluster. And so they chose one cluster, one team, and they had all members tested. Anytime you choose one group and everyone is forced to participate, that is always cluster sampling. Is this choice maybe an appropriate choice? The problem is, it's not. Okay? There's no guarantee that it's good or bad, but some teams might have heavy drug use, other teams might have no drug use. So if we're only selecting one team, we may not get that variety of players, so we may not know if there's really an issue with drug testing in baseball. So your work when you come to class will be questions like these. They'll give you a situation, and all you have to do is tell me what type of sampling is it. And you'll get a worksheet when you come to class.